Hey folks, welcome back to Season 2, Episode 8, Podcast 18 of Corax and Coffee Cast. I'm your host, Pete Steele.
And I'm your other host, Rick Hendricks.
And so you know about us bringing new people into the hobby. We say that every time, but we do like bringing new gamers into the space to bolster their love of games and also just get new ideas into the space. Creativity breeds creativity.
Absolutely. Like any hobby, if we stop bringing new people in, the hobby dies.
Yeah, we don't want that because we like playing games. Speaking of ways to expand the board game hobbyist space, see what I did there?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
We're going to be talking about all things board game expansions today. Before we get into that, we want to thank our behind-the-scenes people who make all this possible, especially our producer, Keegan King. What's up, Keegan? All right, Rick, what are we doing today?
So today we're talking about expansions in tabletop gaming. We're going to talk about what is and what is not an expansion. We're going to discuss 3 broad types of expansions as we define them. And we're going to tell you a little bit about what expansions might do for the base game that they attach to. We're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of playing with expansions and how we tend to judge expansions. We tend to judge them in ways that are kind of a little similar to how we judge the base game, but with a more focused look to how it actually affects the actual main experience. But we'll get into that later. We're going to go over 3 reasons to buy board game expansions. We're going to talk about some expansions that are just a must-have and some that we think really missed the mark. And then we're going to discuss the hotly debated question of, when you're trying to count the number of games in your collection, do you count the expansions or do you not?
Oh, I'm definitely going to add drama there for sure.
I'm looking forward to it.
Rick, you could almost say that this agenda is expansive.
You could.
Wow, I thought you were really going to bust on me for that. I'm amazed I got away with that.
Well, the way we judge expansions is a little different from some other things, and it's, it can be surprising.
Okay, you're being very kind to me. So board games and tabletop gaming has become more organic, more flexible, and their boundaries have become grayer and softer over the past 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. As, prior to 25 years ago, for the most part, you had kind of cookie cutter board game boxes. You bought the game, and that was the entire experience. And that kind of shifted, and now we have version 2.0. You have new editions of game, but you also have like expansions of games where you can play the base game, as well as an expansion of it with additional components and rules and ways to play and things like that. A number of companies also have storage modules to make the game more accessible. You can get deluxe components to get rid of your cardboard and paper components and get metal coins and resin pieces and this type of thing. Cloth pieces. Mm-hmm. Players create homebrew reference sheets, create documents that are full of rules, clarifications, additional player aids. Are all of these things expansions? And I would say no.
Yeah, it's really hard to call deluxe components an expansion. It doesn't really change the game. It changes the game, but it's not adding much to it. It's just sort of replacing.
Yeah. It's kind of a squishy construct. And the only reason we're bringing any of this up is because for new people coming into the hobby, when they see things like a wooden storage container that you place inside of your board game box, they're like, oh, is this an expansion? Or you bring in deluxe components. Is this an expansion? No, the expansion is kind of does something else, maybe depending with, again, additional rules, additional components. And sometimes players will store their expansions and their base games together in the same box to save shelf space. Mm-hmm. And new players can be confused by that. They're like, wait, with all of these new physical things that you can add to your game, because the construct is squishy, it's harder for people new to gaming to understand where the game ends or what's part of the game. And it's just like, well, it depends on how you want to play. And they say, well, aren't there rules to the game? And you say, yes.
And you can buy very many different sets of rules for this same game. And
yeah.
Then it gets very confusing.
All these things that are kind of just learned, knowledge that's learned or grandfathered in, just makes it even more challenging for newbies, even though the possibility space is greater.
Right. So we're going to break down a little bit what we think the 3 types of expansions are. So tabletop expansions generally do one of 3 things. And these are all relative terms. Probably going to find elements of all of these in every expansion, but you'll get to know what I'm talking about when I get there. So the 3 things that expansions generally do, we're going to call fixing, focusing, and sandboxing.
All right, so fixing. When you have an expansion that's a fixing expansion, the primary goal of that expansion is to fix a broken base game, to improve game flow, fix areas where certain elements and rules are too powerful or not powerful enough, to decrease downtime potentially. These are expansions that you really never want to play without once they're available, because they just are designed to improve the flow of the base game or alter the rules or rewrite the rules in a way so it's just a much more enjoyable experience.
So this is mostly like a software patch to fix something we figured out was not working well.
Right.
So the next type of expansion is a focusing expansion. Focusing expansions will take the game in a new direction, maybe shed some light on some of the mechanics that haven't gotten any use prior. So an example of this might be an RPG supplement that's all about magic or equipment that adds in some spells, that adds in maybe some classes, that sort of a thing. And the last type of expansion is what we're going to call a sandboxing expansion. So this increases the sandbox value, or the size of the world of the game. This gives you more domains to play around in. If they're adding another city or another plane of existence, or some really big story elements, that's what we're talking about here. And these are great. If you have a bigger sandbox, there's more possibility that you can explore this with some friends, you can get more people in, and you can really start building your own things inside of this larger world that's been created for you. Or, if you're not feeling quite so world building, you can just throw sand in each other's faces, and you get some new tools to do exactly that.
Yeah, and that's cool too.
Yeah.
There are some expansions who are those fixing expansions. The majority of expansions for games really fall into the category of either focusing or sandboxing expansions, where they're taking a game in a certain direction, or they're just kind of expanding it in every direction or most directions. And that tends to add complexity, right?
Right. Yeah, in general, your fixing would be done in a special edition or something that would re-release the base game. That is generally how that's done.
It's ideally how it's done. I've definitely seen it done, without a second edition. Like, just have this expansion.
Sure.
Which tends to be cheaper. But because, for the most part, expansions do increase the complexity of a game, like we talked about in a previous episode, that makes it less likely to see table time.
Yep. It's something that you maybe have to introduce the base game, and then you have to introduce the supplement and addition, and that all takes time, and that's a hump for people to get over.
We talked about how the greater the player count you need for a game, the less time it's going to see on the table, just as on average across players and gamer groups. The more complex a game, the longer a game takes. All things are going to limit its table time, or at least number of times it makes it to the table. I have all 6 expansions to Cosmic Encounter, and they're all great, and I love them, and I think many of them improve the game. But since acquiring all 6 expansions, the base game of Cosmic Encounter alone has seen more time on my table than playing with any expansion elements combined. Just be thinking about when you purchase an expansion for the game, once you get out, have a base game and have played it a few times, and you've seen expansions coming out and it gets released, and you're so excited about because you live this game and you're like, I need that expansion. That's when you're most excited about this game. That's how they get you.
And there are some expansions out there, we're going to talk about a few of them, that really complete the game that they're being added onto. They make the game playable, and you really are going to have a very hard time playing without that expansion. There are some expansions that really add a ridiculous amount to the game that they're modifying, but these are exceptions rather than the rule.
So, Rick, we talked about kind of the 3 general types of expansions in terms of fixing, focusing, or sandboxing. And I think within those 3 categories, there are generally 2 different applications for expansions, in that you have expansions that go all or nothing. You play with all of the expansion, and very often that expansion will have replacement components and, cards or dice or whatever for some of the things in the base game.
Sure. You're changing the DNA of the game, and now it all has to be game expanded.
Right. And you have another type of expansion, which again can be fixing, focusing, or sandboxing. And these are more modular expansions, rather than changing the DNA of the game. You're you're just giving the game a hat, maybe a suit.
Right.
Taking it out to a nice cafe, buy it, wine and oysters by the bay. I don't know.
And if you look at RPGs, especially, in a way, Dungeons and Dragons is all expansion. You've got, obviously, things that are made by Wizard of the Coast. You've got different settings. You've got different classes. You've got all these things. You don't have to use any or all of those.
It's completely modular. It's completely
modular. Yeah, you can go over to Hang with Strahd if you like vampires, or you can just completely ignore that if you don't.
If you break down tabletop gaming and hobby gaming into the categories as we have, as LARPing, tabletop RPGs, miniatures wargaming, card games, and board games, I think almost in that order, they become more modular. In LARPing, you can do anything you want, anything non-verbal, verbal, people see it, it's all improv, it's moment-by-moment modularity.
Exactly.
And then you have tabletop RPGs, which is just not quite as modular or improvisational as LARPing in many ways. And you're looking in books and you're like, you take what you want.
Depending on which system you're using, you can... Yeah.
And then after that, I'd say card games Card games and miniatures games are kind of neck and neck with that. Customizable card games and miniatures.
Right, exactly.
And then board games, which are the least modular and
right.
kind of the most take all of it or none of it. But again, this is just kind of what comes out of our heads.
Sure.
Let's talk about how we evaluate expansions and how it's a little bit different in some ways from evaluating base games.
Right.
And this is not a comprehensive list. These are just some things we think about. Many of the things we think about, like mechanics, we also think about in base games, but we think about them a little bit differently.
Right, because the expansion sort of has to justify its existence in a different way than the base game does.
Exactly. So when we think about mechanics for expansions, we think about, did the expansion offer additional content that was actually really necessary to expand the possibilities for the game, or could have players done that with the base game on their own, given enough time? Mm-hmm. Does an expansion unnecessarily or overcomplicate previous rules mechanics in ways that are just fussy and confusing rather than exciting?
Right. Does it make it more difficult to play it?
Right. By more difficult to play beyond what it's actually worth.
Exactly. Yeah.
Once an expansion comes out, do the mechanics make players think that this always needs to be played with? Is this a necessary expansion? Which can be a positive thing or correcting a negative thing.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Does the expansion not offer so many new things that it would have been better just to redesign the game from the ground up in a second edition? And Rick, you're kind of talking about this before.
Yeah, exactly. It's much better to build a new house than to have a million little additions that are falling off.
Right.
So speaking of a million little additions that are falling off, artwork. Does the artwork of the expansion match the artwork and tone of that base game? And does it match the other expansions? Or do you have sort of this awkward kaleidoscope of themes and tones?
Yeah, I think artwork goes such a long way into making an expansion feel like it's actually integrated into the universe of the game, or just kind of tacked on as an afterthought and a cash grab. Mm-hmm. And the former is great, and the latter is just, it does not feel good.
And of course, as always, artwork is a big part of why you pick up the game or not.
Right. And, not having dissimilar artwork challenges your suspension of disbelief. You don't want to, when you're playing a game, you don't want to feel like you're someone sitting at the game playing a game about mystery and intrigue. You want to feel that mystery and intrigue. You want to be in the game. You want it to be immersive. And artwork that doesn't match just destroys that so quickly.
Yeah, and it could be difficult if you're doing sort of a tonal shift. If you're moving from sort of a fantasy element of your world to a steampunk element, it's how do we get the new flavor in there but still have it tied to the original game? And then,
that can be fine, in my opinion. That can be fine, as long as you really kind of write the new lore in a way that it makes sense about how those two themes or time periods or what have you are integrated.
Exactly.
But if the artwork in your base game is, I don't know, like looks impressionist in some ways, and then everything from your expansion looks like sci-fi rotoscoped art, it doesn't go together.
Right.
It makes it seem very much like, okay, these clearly came out of the heads of different creators. They don't go in the same universe. So let's talk about how an expansion is produced and what's advertised both on the box and on the components inside. And part of this is independent production. It's very, very important that if you have a tabletop game that is an expansion, that the outside cover on the box advertises it as such. And for the most part, publishers have gotten good at this, saying, this is an expansion, base game required, or cannot play without base game, or something like that. But this should not be in the fine print. You're going to get a lot of annoyed customers and angry returns if you don't put this in the fine print. I mean, if you leave this in the fine print.
I can definitely see certain of my relatives buying me an expansion for a game and being very happy that they got me something they think I like, and it's like, oh yeah, this isn't something I can play. This is an expansion for a game that I don't have, and I guess I'm buying the game now. But yeah, it's important to be clear about these things.
Right. And related to that, and this is actually both related to clear markings on the outside of the box that people need to be told that this thing is an expansion, especially if it can't be played without the base game. But also the components inside need to be marked as expansion material. And this goes back to artwork, and this can be a difficult tightrope to walk depending on your game components. But I think it needs to be very clear that your expansion components are clearly marked. Icons on cards, stamps on the bottom of game components, that these are expansion components and not part of the base game. Because if you play with them together and integrate them, but you want to separate them out again because you want to play the base game alone, or maybe you own the base game and your buddy owns the expansion and brought it over and he wants to take it home with him at the end of the night.
Yep.
It needs to be very easy to not only integrate the components, but separate them out as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Right. You need to be able to sort those cards back out by the little icon on them, and not be searching Wikipedia for, wait, was this card in the base game or the expansion?
Right. And, some games are really good at this, and other games are really bad at this, and some games are in between. And it is becoming a best practice for sure, but it needs to go further and become the standard.
So that's something that we look for, when we're looking at expansions. We also look at how well this whole project was integrated together. We look at things like, can the expansion components fit within the base game box? Did we think ahead and make room for them, or are these going to be overcrowded and they're not going to fit? Do we have a storage solution that accommodates enough more cards to put the expansion components in there in a way that will keep them organized, and etc.?
And look, I do understand, we do understand that this can be very tricky for a lot of designers and publishers. We do understand that the margins on most board games is razor thin, with no guarantee of success. And so it doesn't always make good financial sense or even possible sense to plan ahead. Sometimes you don't know if you'll be able to afford an expansion until your game does really well, if it does really well. And other times with larger publishers, it's easier to make more plan ahead just in terms of the overhead as well as the risk in cost and building in the potential expansion into your base game in terms of space and things like that.
And we also try and look at, you may not be able to afford to make an expansion to your game unless your game goes really well. But if you're making an expansion for your game, it should be because you have more to say.
Yes.
It shouldn't just be because your game did really well and you bet that if you slap that name on another box, other people will buy whatever's in that other box. Does this game have an actual reason to be made apart from, making the developer more money?
Let's talk about instructions in the rule book. I have some very strong opinions about this.
Yeah, because suddenly you have to read 2 rule books, right?
And some expansions will include 2 rule books where it's the rules just for the expansion, and then a second rule book which is all of the integrated rules with the expansion. I think this is fantastic when publishers do that. But that aside, question for the designer: does your expansion make the rules more complicated? If yes, make sure your expanded material is worth it for the more complicated rules. Number 2, even if your rules are more complicated, is your new rulebook easier to understand than it is in the base game? If you're not constantly moving in this direction, you have a problem.
Yeah, if I need the original game rulebook and the expansion rulebook, and I'm lost going between one or the other and trying to figure out what you mean by a term, you haven't done very well.
Rick, how do we feel about themes in expansions? What's our feeling there?
I mean, in general, your theme for your expansion should line up with the theme of your base game.
Just like the artwork.
Just like the art. Now, this is tricky because, like I said, you should only be designing an expansion if you have more to say. And maybe that more to say is a step to the left in terms of theme. But you need to have it be complementary. You need to have it be a consistent whole when put together and not just random clashing symbols of theme.
Replayability. We've already talked about this a little bit. If your expansion overly complicates your game, or it's going to be harder to get to the table. But answer this question: will playing with the expansion make you more excited to get that game to the table? This is just another way of saying the expansion needs to be worth the extra effort to get the expansion to the table as well as the base game, because it is more effort 19 times out of 20.
Exactly.
And I say this as somebody who's very positive on expansions, but I've been burned a number of times. Mm-hmm. So,
but this is a double-edged sword. It's how do we make it easier to integrate, and how do we make it worth integrating? And if you can do either of those really well, then you're probably doing all right. We also look at whether the expansion unnecessarily turns the base game from a game into a game system.
Whatever do you mean, Richard?
So
that's like such a big question to answer.
It is a big question. Are you adding a ridiculous extra amount of rules to the point where you're no longer even playing the same game that you were before?
I mean, I think of a game system as the ultimate sandbox, right? It's really a smorgasbord. Take what you want, leave the rest. You can plug and play as much as you want, and you're kind of mucking around and throwing sand and whatever else inside of a particular universe, inside of a particular sandbox.
Sure.
Versus a game, it has much more of a specific direction or limited experience, even with the expansion.
Right. Yeah, so if we started out playing Monopoly and now we're playing Pathfinder, we took a wrong turn somewhere.
Or a right turn.
Right. But again, if we took that big of a right turn, it probably should have been a separate game.
I have to say, though, I think 5e ruined me for Pathfinder. When 4e came out, I was like, no, I'm going to stick with my 3-5 Pathfinder stuff for D&D. But when 5 came out, 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, I was like, I have to... Pathfinder, it's been a good run. I love you. I'll think about you. I won't write you because I'll be rolling my 5e characters.
Well, you know what they say. 5e is one of those things where they really simplified, some might say oversimplified for 4th edition D&D. And then they sort of circled back to try and pick up some of the dyed-in-the-wool old fans with 5e and said, okay, let's add it back in some of the complexity. Let's keep the things we're doing right, but let's get some more of that flavor in there and make sure that different classes feel different, etc., etc.
And for, first edition D&D, 1st and 1.5 are for just, ground floor fans of the game, right?
They can be unwieldy if you're not used to them, yes.
Yeah. 2nd edition is for people who enjoy doing math more than they like playing role-playing games. 3.5 is for people who enjoy throwing sand at each other's faces in the sandbox. 4e is for people who don't actually want to enjoy the game that they're playing, and 5e is for people who can't read or write.
Okay. I'm not sure that I'm with you on those last two, but
I'm still bitter about the 4th edition game that I played with my brother's friends. Bless them all, but man, oh man, was that rough. I think we're actually...
This sounds like something for a different podcast.
I think we're actually going to talk about that in the next podcast. So here's a little teaser trailer for that. I'm going to talk about my horrible experience playing 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons in podcast 29. So sticker, you just come back next week.
So Pete, I'm not sure that this expansion to the conversation is matching with the theme of the rest of the conversation. So
did you just say expansion to the conversation rather than expand it? Is that where we are?
That's where we are, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about design vision.
Sure, yeah. So again, not unnecessarily moving into a whole game system. If you started out as a focused experience, you probably shouldn't be moving into a bigger sandbox thing where nobody knows where they're going. And you also need to make sure that your expansion is something you could kind of see from the original game, that it meets the same vision. You don't want to have it diluted to the point where it used to be a game about one thing and now it's a game about everything. And you don't want it to go wildly off into left field. If it's supposed to work with the base game, then it should really kind of complement the base game and, again, be that cohesive whole. That said, if you look at this and you say that additional or future expansions would further enhance this game, does this expansion that we're looking at right now easily allow for that other expansion to come in? Are we leaving hooks open to continue in this direction, or are we causing problems for ourselves? And then also, if you have multiple expansions, does it take less than 10 minutes to shuffle them all in together and get them all working, and less than another 10 minutes to separate them out again into pieces? Have you made a symphony that works well together, or is this an elaborate machine that takes hours and hours to set up?
I think all of that makes sense. And just as we wrap up here, just a couple of kind of simple things that we consider. Just innovation. And we've already really been talking about this, but does the expansion improve or enhance in a meaningful way the overall game experience over the base game? Yes or no?
Yeah. It's a simple question, but it needs to be asked.
Yeah.
Other simple questions that need to be asked. Does this expansion turn off players who were enjoying the previous unmodified game?
Yes.
Does this new expansion whet your appetite for future expansions? Or does it say, oh, well, these people jumped the shark and we're done?
And all of what we're talking about here really boils down to some aspect of comprehensive synergy.
Yeah.
Would the base game not have been better as a self-contained system without the existence of the expansion? What really improves it when you're talking about artwork, when you're talking about mechanics, when you're talking about how it's integrated, when you're talking about design, when you're talking about rules? It's really all about, is this union synergistic or not? And when you add in the expansion, do you have to suffer more than just a minor bump over the railroad tracks into expansion land? I don't know where that metaphor came from, but I think train games have, train games are a subgenre that have fewer expansions than any other. Value for money. Ultimately, is the expansion worth your hard-earned dollars? That's maybe the ultimate question. Let's talk about 3 reasons to buy board game expansions.
Sure. We're going to go into a few reasons, and
3. We're going into 3. Exactly 3, Richard.
Yeah, a few. 3. And we've dubbed these good or bad reasons. Please
Are you sure it's not several? Is it several reasons? A few or several?
Few is 3.
Few is 3, several is 3 or 4. Is that right? A couple is 2. I hate it when it drives me nuts when people say a couple when they mean 4. I'm like, that's not a couple. That's 2 couples.
That's a couple couples.
So we're going to talk about a few, aka 3 reasons to buy board game expansions.
And we're going to label those good or bad reasons to buy them. Those obviously come with some implied shoulds or should nots. Please take those lightly. We have no illusions here.
No illusions, or people going to follow our advice?
Yeah, we try not to let that stop us.
I think we're just void screaming, be like, we like games, we like games, we like games.
Yes, but not that one because we're bitter old men, apparently.
Speaking of being bitter old men, this was like 6 months ago. I saw these young children, they're probably 6 or 7, throwing rocks up at a squirrel in a tree. And I was like, hey, kids, knock it off. and I felt like I was 1,000 years old.
Yeah, that's rough.
But I would do it again because don't throw rocks at squirrels. Don't do it. Why would you do that?
Why would you? No. I tell you, kids these days just need to learn.
Thank goodness we were never them.
Thank goodness.
So board games. Board games are really good. So let's talk about 3 reasons to buy expansions.
Sure, let's do that. We
play a lot of board game expansions. So I'm having a hard time focusing, Rick. What's our number 1 reason? We talked about this last night. We're like, we have 3 reasons that we want to tell our viewers or our listeners.
Yeah, so our first reason is if you're a player of games who really enjoys the mechanics of this game and the intellectual property, and you really want to expand your experience with it, and you want to see more of what it has to offer.
You want an expanded universe of one type or another, right?
Exactly.
By all means, if you love the universe, you want to see more of it, pick up the expansion. Just like a television show. You bought season 1, time for season 2 through 9.
Yeah. If you've brought this thing to the table 15 times already, go nuts. Buy the expansion. You'll be fine.
You don't need a job or friends or love.
I mean, fit all that in if there's room for it.
I have known more than one friend who met their spouse at board game night. Just putting it out there. If there were ever a reason to go to board game night, there you go.
Your mileage may vary.
We make no guarantees. But you never know.
So that's reason number 1. You want more of this world. It's a great reason to buy an expansion. Reason number 2 that people pick up an expansion is if you're a collector or if you just know yourself and you're a completionist and you want all of this world.
It's a really insidious way for dollars to convert from your dollars to their dollars.
Yeah.
Again, like if you are a collector and like Rick said,
if you know yourself and you know that this is what you're after, then great. You might be able to play this once or twice. You might tinker with it and see how it relates in comparison to the base game. You're probably not going to get it to the table a lot, and in some sense, you're probably not going to get value for your money. But if you're a collector, that's not what you're after anyway.
Right. So reason number 3, and this is the bad reason to buy board game expansion, and this is fear of missing out, FOMO. We all know, everybody knows that production runs of most board games are small because, like we've already said, most margins on most board games are razor thin. And so larger production runs is very risky. That means the board game market fluctuates a lot. The secondary market fluctuates a lot. And once a board game is gone from availability, there's no guarantee it's coming back at any sort of reasonable price.
Yeah.
So this is where the board game FOMO comes from.
Right. And the problem with this logic is this is logic for buying every board game expansion. And they are printing way more games than you can reasonably own and play.
Rick, you're making me sad.
Well, I'm going to keep going because at the end of your life... You're making
everyone sad. We all want all the games.
I understand that. But at the end of your life, there will be several amazing games that you never got around to playing.
I'm still sad, man. You have not shifted.
I have not, but chances are really good that this expansion you're looking to buy is not going to be one of those games that you get to whatever's beyond this and all your friends say, oh yeah, this was the one you should have played.
Right.
You need an actual reason to buy and play this expansion instead of something new. And if you don't have that reason, just let it go. There will be more awesomeness later, and you don't have to miss everything by chasing everything.
All I can think about is Let It Go by Frozen right now. You should probably come slap me. So, let's talk about my list and your list of must-have expansions.
Yeah.
This list kind of came about, Rick, I think like maybe a week ago when I don't know what we were doing. I think we were just throwing gum at a wall or something. Like we had ideas for podcasts up on poster board and we were flicking gum off the end of a ruler.
We were being very productive.
Yeah, and we're like, what should we talk about? So Zia, Embers of a Forsaken Star.
Mm-hmm.
This for me falls under the category of a fixer expansion that I would never want to play without. I love Zia, Embers of a Drift System. Legends of a Drift System. I'm combining the titles now. The base game is Zia, Legends of a Drift System, which is basically Escape Velocity by Ambrosia Software, shareware back from the 90s. It's basically Escape Velocity as a board game, and it's awesome, and I love it. Yes, it's basically pick up and deliver, but I know we're going to lose half our fans for me saying this, I actually enjoy quality pick up and deliver games. I think they can be fun. So the base game is Zia, Legends of a Drift System.
And this is basically just a patch errata thing.
It fixes a lot of rules, but it also expands the game as well. So it both fixes it and it's a sandbox.
Right.
So it fixes balancing issues. It makes exploration and buying and selling goods much more rewarding. Kind of the game is broken that you can kind of pirate or go do missions, and those are better options than just kind of like exploring and delivering goods unless you had a really good route based on the modular map.
Which is unfortunate because then you don't get to explore.
Exactly. Next on my list is Dominion Prosperity.
Now, why are we still talking about Dominion? This is not a new or a fresh game, Pete.
It is not. Dominion has been around since 2008, but this is a perfect example of a game that started as a game that has expanded into a game system. When Dominion came out, it was a game. Then you had Dominion Intrigue, and it was an expansion, and now there are 14 or 15 expansions, and they're all modular and plug and play, and it's a game system now of Dominion. And their expansion of Allies just came out in 2022. The game is still actively supported by the publisher. And I actually think that Dominion is one of the best level 2 or maybe level 3 gateway games. You play some Catan, you play some Carcassonne, you play a couple of other things, and then right up you hit them with the Dominion and get them in on deck building games.
Honestly, I agree. We played a lot of Dominion over the years, and it is a good game. It's very good at getting people who are not deep into gaming yet.
And to be honest, like, there are plenty of games that I like more than Dominion, but unless I'm in a really bad mood, if somebody comes up to me and says, fancy a game of Dominion, I'll be like, absolutely. I'm down for that 99% of the time.
Right. And it's very easy to get to the table, and that is so important. So anyway, you wanted to talk about Prosperity.
I did. I still maintain that Intrigue, Dominion Intrigue, which is the first expansion, is the most essential expansion for Dominion. But I get most excited about talking about cards in Prosperity with anyone who will listen. But Prosperity will kind of spoil you. Once you experience the shininess and the wealth that's involved, this will always be the expansion you want to play with because it increases the possibilities base with any limited game. You know, in Dominion, a game might end before you can buy the most powerful cards. In Prosperity, you can get the most powerful cards at the beginning of the game or mid-game because of all of the wealth that you'll have.
Yeah, it throws in an entirely new class of coin.
Yeah.
That gets you buying cards much faster. And yeah, it is nice and fun because you get to actually play in all of the awesome heady waters that you might not reach with other expansions.
And being wealthier in Prosperity doesn't make the game easier. It just fundamentally alters what's important in the game. So it expands and it focuses.
Yeah.
And so, you know, non-Prosperity strategies will not work with Prosperity and vice versa.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's always the most fun part of a Dominion, right? Is it's when do you switch from deck building to grabbing the victory points.
Exactly.
And if you time that wrong, you will lose. And you might lose atop a pile of gold, but you'll still lose.
Yeah, gold is worthless at the end. You can't take it with you. Although you can't take your dominions with you either. So
yeah,
I don't know where to go from here. I'm sad again. If you do have the base game of Dominion, and if you're looking at purchasing another Dominion box, I would absolutely recommend that you buy Intrigue first, but then after you have the base set and Intrigue, Prosperity, pick that up next. And while the MSRP is like $45, you can find them at a lot of retailers, even brick and mortar retailers, for $40, $35 sometimes.
Yeah, and again, it's a very easy game to get to the table, which is hugely important.
Yeah, I mean, there are 3 steps per turn. Action, buy, cleanup. It's ABC. Couldn't be simpler. So, Star Wars Rebellion, Rise of the Empire.
Yeah. So basically, this is Rogue One, the expansion.
Yes, indeed.
Rise of the Empire adds quite a bunch of stuff. It's new leader characters, new cards, a whole new combat system, some more unit types, and a lot of plastic figures.
When you do play with this expansion, you remove some of the cards from the original game. I hate it when expansions make you do that. Where am I supposed to put these extra things?
Yeah. Have you ever given any thought to house rolling those cards back in?
I mean, yes. But the reality is that I don't like this game enough to screw around with house rules.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I like to house rule games all the time, but there are 100 games on my list that I would rather spend my time experimenting with in house ruling rather than Star Wars Rebellion. So the reality is that's just not going to happen.
That's fair.
Other players might disagree. So many people love this game. I think I've enjoyed it. I've had fun with it. I like it more with the expansion. I'm not going to screw around house ruling it.
Sure. It's fair.
I think the reason why this is an essential expansion, I don't think it has a little bit of sandboxing to it. It's not a focusing expansion. It does fix a few things, specifically the combat in the game. And this is why I think that even though I don't love the base game to begin with, I would never play it without Rise of the Empire as an expansion. I'm glad I purchased it because in the base game, combat is clunky and there are so many steps and it just slows the whole game down. And I like it so much better when you in games that have lots of political intrigue and socializing and deal making and economics. And then if a game has any sort of combat in it, which can be actually like simulated physical combat or any sort of confrontation, I really appreciate it when the intelligence of a game just kind of falls off at that point and you duke it out, because this game speeds up and you have less time to think and analyze and you just go at it, and then you have to next turn or next round kind of pick up the pieces of what you once had.
And it's more immersive that way, to have combat be this urgent thing that's over kind of quickly.
Right.
But yeah,
and Star Wars Rebellion does the opposite thing. When you get to combat, which is exciting, the anticipation of combat is exciting, and then you engage in combat, and it's just a slog. And when I play Star Wars Rebellion without the expansion, I would find myself avoiding combat only because I didn't want to do it because it wasn't exciting. It was just arduous.
Right.
And the expansion fixes that for the most part, which is great.
It's that thing where you say, oh, I want to grapple my opponents, and then we get out the 75 books of grapple rules, and you say, never mind.
Never mind, it's just not worth it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Viticulture Tuscany.
Ooh, yeah. Viticulture is a game about making wine on your vineyard as you grow your winery into a successful operation. You use your workers to perform important tasks on the vineyard throughout the year to grow grapes, to make wine, to expand the vineyard, and fulfill orders.
It's a really fun game. You grab a glass of wine or your preferred beverage and play a game about making wine in Italy. Like maybe you can't afford, a villa in Tuscany with kind of an open air kitchen, all nice, fine, rosewood. You've got your herbs hanging down, the breeze coming in off the hills where you've got your vineyard. Most people can't afford that, right? But you can put that on your tabletop and play it and pretend. And Tuscany only makes that more immersive. My love of this expansion comes from the new expanded board that has all the actions broken down into 4 seasons rather than the original 2. You have a new wake-up chart where players choose player order. The wake-up chart is really a game changer for me. But the bonuses really help players and helps players get up and running more quickly.
Which is so important because the beginning stages of a game can often drag on, where it's like, okay, I'm getting my resources up, but I'm not really going to be able to do anything for 3 more turns.
Yeah. You get your hands on cards more quickly. There's more action selection. It expands the game in all of the right ways and that were needed, but you didn't even realize they were needed until the expansion came out. So playing Viticulture, the base game, is actually really fun. It's not like, oh, I wish this game had an expansion and that'd be worth it. No, Viticulture's fun. But once you play with Tuscany, you just think, oh, thank goodness this exists. This just makes this fun thing even more fun.
They just did a really great job.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think we have a couple of honorable mentions that we don't think are essential expansions, but we wanted to mention. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start off with Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which is D&D 5e. Mostly what Tasha's Cauldron offers you is some new class options for your characters. And if you have wanted for your entire career, as honestly I think I have, nothing more than to be a soul knife, capable of ripping your enemies to shreds with the power of your mind before they even see you, then Tasha's Cauldron...
You should maybe get a referral for therapy, Rick. Therapy's great. Everyone should get therapy. It's good for you.
I don't disagree.
Going to the dentist is good. Getting physical good. Go to therapy. Take care of yourself. Then buy yourself something nice that you can afford. Impulse shopping is bad, kids. But okay, PSA over. We're talking about Dungeons and Dragons. Go.
But role-playing a rogue is really fun, and role-playing a rogue who can use psionics is even more fun because you can make people forget they saw you. And if that's the sort of thing that you're really looking for, Tasha's Cauldron could become the most important D&D book you ever own.
That's very dramatic.
Well, I mean, what your main character has his roots in is
I'm not complaining. I'm saying you're very dramatic. You should be a dungeon master. Have you ever thought of taking on a second career as a dungeon master?
Stop trying to get me to DM for you.
Oh man, I don't want to do it again.
We're looking for the time. All right. So, like most expansions for role-playing games, the value of Tasha's Cauldron is highly subjective. It gives you a lot of options that might be vital to you, but if you're happy enough with what you've got in the base game, you might leave with only an extra feat or two, and it really might not be worth your money. Similarly, Eberron Rising from the Last War is essential if you love Artificers, Warforged, and Lightning Trains, but it's pretty worthless for you if your party doesn't like steampunk elements. And again, most role-playing expansions are going to be kind of on this level of, if this is your jam, you're going to love it, and if you really weren't looking for more, you don't need to buy it.
I'm going to talk about Castle Panic, the Wizard's Tower. Castle Panic being the base game, and I have to say, Castle Panic, the base game, and actually all of the expansions, really bothered me, because I never have ever won. Ever. Mm-hmm. And I know it can be won because I have seen 8-year-olds win at game stores. I've observed them win.
But it's just not how your brain works.
It's not like, so I know I sounded like 1,000 there, like kids today are playing all these games, but it's a board game, right? It's not technology, not electronics. It's a tower defense game. I don't enjoy tower defense games. I'm not good at tower defense games, clearly, but many people do enjoy tower defense games. And I think Castle Panic is probably the perfect gateway game for people who enjoy tower defense games. And the Wizard's Tower, that expansion, if you enjoy this game, which I do not, but I can appreciate the game and I can appreciate that this expansion adds all of the right things. Mm-hmm. In this game, it's a cooperative game where you and your players are defending this castle against ogres and trolls and bears and monsters and lions and tigers, oh my. And you're just, in every direction, these monsters come from out of the forest, and you have to have your knights and your infantrymen and just kind of defend in all directions so your castle is safe and these monsters don't come in and destroy your keep. And with the Wizard's Tower, it adds a wizard, it adds magic, it adds spells, it adds fire. Like, fire is awesome.
Absolutely.
As long as it's in your fireplace, not burning down your castle.
Especially if you're dealing with trolls, you need the fire.
You need the fire for the trolls. Fire elementals like the fire. So
be careful with that, yeah.
Be careful with that, but it's really wonderful. The Castle Panic has other expansions. If you enjoy Castle Panic, you'll probably enjoy all of those expansions, but I would definitely urge you to pick up the Wizard's Tower first.
That's the one that feels like it just fits.
I'm going to talk about an expansion that I do not like. Twilight Imperium, Prophecy of Kings.
Okay. Stay tuned for Pete's 10-part...
Dude.
podcast on why he hates Twilight Imperium Prophecy of Kings.
So, I love Twilight Imperium. I've loved Twilight Imperium for years. I did not play first or second edition. I bought third edition of Twilight Imperium back in 2005. I saw it on the shelf of my friendly local game store, and I knew we were going to be together forever. I was wrong. We had a wonderful relationship from 2005, 2017, when Twilight Imperium 4th edition came out. and I found the new, not love of my life, but runner-up. I don't know. I love Twilight Imperium, and so when Prophecy of Kings came out, I bought it immediately.
Sure, because it was more of that universe that you wanted to experience.
It was more of that universe. I wanted to own it. I wanted to play it. I wanted to love it. And if you love Prophecy of Kings, and I know there are lots of people who do, I am not going to yuck your yum, except that I am. Now, if you love it, if you want to play with Prophecy of Kings with POK, go for it. But for me, and for everybody, really, when you think about it, Twilight Imperium is a game of grand strategy. It's a big box relative to other board game boxes, but it is a entire galaxy, or at least sector of a galaxy, on your tabletop. And this is something that new players have a hard time with, because they don't realize just how much of a scale down Twilight Imperium is. Most games that have combat, that have battle, most board games, are actually very tactical in nature. Even if they're strategic in theme, they're tactical in their mechanics. Twilight Imperium is not. Twilight Imperium mechanically is a game of grand strategy.
We're not sweating the small stuff here. We don't care about the fighters.
We're not. And if you think about all of the movement rules and movement restriction rules in Twilight Imperium, the reason for them is to make the game appear scaled up in this way. So, I'm going to talk about more about this in another episode. I'm going to make season 4 of Corax and Coffee Cast all about Twilight Imperium if I don't get shut down by Rick and Keegan.
We're working on it, people. Keep the faith.
So here's the problem. Twilight Imperium is a game of grand strategy, not tactics. And Prophecy of Kings, the expansion for 4th edition Twilight Imperium, brings in heroes and individualized mechs and makes you try and sweat the small stuff, the special abilities, more so than you already had to with flagships and things like that. And by focusing on the special abilities, making it more granular of specific heroes in specific places, you take away from the grand strategy of the game. And so Prophecy of Kings is not a fixing expansion. It's sandboxing to an extent. It does add cool things like exploration, which I love, but it's really a focusing expansion. The problem is, what it focuses on is a 180-degree shift from what Twilight Imperium is all about.
Right. And therefore it's something that doesn't particularly fit in, at least for you.
Yeah. And here's the thing, is that it's also, Prophecy of Kings is not a modular expansion, because there are some things about it that I love, like the exploration elements that increase the wonder of the game space. That's great. Mm-hmm. But I can't play that without, for balancing issues, without the granularity aspects of the game, like the heroes and the mechs.
Right.
Because it's not modular. You have to, put all of it into your game, take out cards from the old set, which you already know I do not like, to integrate Prophecy of Kings. So, this is what happened to me. I had my base set of Twilight Imperium 4th edition, bought Prophecy of Kings, realized you had to add all of it into the game and swap out old components. I didn't want to do that after my first game of Prophecy of Kings, because I wanted to be able to play base edition, the base game, easily. So I bought, and I'm really embarrassed in saying this, I bought a second edition, a second copy of the base game, so I could have a very easily accessible base game of Twilight Imperium and a set of Twilight Imperium integrated with Prophecy of Kings to play with friends who wanted to play with Prophecy of Kings. And that's how Fantasy Flight got another $120 of my hard-earned money. And I'm sure that's exactly what they wanted. Mm-hmm. And please put out a 5th edition of Twilight Imperium Fantasy Flight. I love you.
Just keep the tactics out of it.
Look, Twilight Imperium is an all-day affair, right? Mm-hmm. And the reality is, I probably only have 10 or 20 games of Twilight Imperium left in my life. And if they're all going to be 4th edition, if I had my druthers, I would play every single one of those 20 games without Prophecy of Kings. If a group of people said, hey, we're playing TI with POK, I would absolutely play, if that's what they want to do.
Because you have to, because you only have so many games left in you.
Right?
You can't let one of those slip by. Yeah.
So there's my thing on Prophecy of Kings, dude. Sorry, not sorry.
Alrighty.
What else are we talking about? Let's talk about Dominion Alchemy.
Sure, yeah.
Intrigue is great. We already talked about that. Prosperity is great. We already talked about that. When Alchemy came out years and years ago and introduced a new currency, which is the potion, on its face, not a bad idea at all. Where you run into problems is the fact that you needed to invest in potions to make them worthwhile. And for that, you needed to have a lot of alchemy cards mixed in with your other kingdom cards, which could come from other expansions. You had to have a lot of alchemy or none at all.
Right.
You couldn't have just a little bit of alchemy.
So essentially you have a fourth upgrade path. You have to have your usual deck, your gold economy, your victory points, and now potions, which are only worth it if you deshore heavily to get them.
So in Dominion, you have all of these different sets, these expansions, and in any given game of Dominion, no matter how many expansions you integrate, you only have 10 sets of cards. And so unless you wanted to have a very alchemy-heavy game, if you only had 1 or 2 or even 3 of the 10 card slots full of alchemy cards, those cards would generally go unpurchased, leaving a lot of your 10 card selection just dead and out of the game.
Because the 3 that you have just aren't enough to work together synergistically.
Exactly. So I would say that synergistically, Alchemy is probably the worst Dominion expansion because it's an all or nothing thing. Which kind of makes it directional, right? Mm-hmm. Focused, but it does not play well with others. It does not play well with others, and it's not good enough on its own to play with more than a couple of times by itself. So it fell flat for me.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and if you are playing with it and you try to use those 3 cards, you're kind of stuck telegraphing your alchemy heavy strategy before it's doing you any good. And meanwhile, other players are just picking up cards that work.
Let's talk about Settlers of Catan, or Catan, or just Catan or Catan, the 5 and 6 player expansion.
Some games are really meant to max out at a certain number of players, and that's just a fact.
Yep.
But it can be difficult for developers to stick to their guns on that.
Yep. Again, this is another expansion that we do not like. We've played a lot of Catan back in the day, and it was certainly not the only game in town, but one of the only accessible games in town back in the late 90s. Mm-hmm. And by accessible, I mean games that were easy to purchase and you didn't have to go to special retailer for, even though Rick and I had already played tons of other hobby games at that point.
Sure.
But also accessible in that you could purchase it easily, other people could purchase it, your non-gamer friends had probably heard of it or were willing to play, right?
Exactly.
It's a gateway game. And so when you have this gateway and you have friends that are interested in a new hobby that you've been playing with and involved with since you were 4, you're like, great, let's bring more people in. So you're like, 5 and 6 player expansion, let's bring more people in. It does not work with Catan. It just doesn't.
It's really well balanced for 4 people.
Right. The base game is.
Right. And when you start adding in other people, it just doesn't work.
Catan is designed to be a 4-player game. It can be played with 3. It's not good with 3. There's not enough tension, but there you go. But as soon as you get to 5 or 6 players, the game slows to a crawl. It just grinds down. It's a snail's pace, and there's not enough game to support that snail's pace. There are too many rolls before your next turn, so it becomes chaotic. There's a bigger risk of hitting a 7 on a dice roll, which means losing your resources before you've collected when you have to roll a die for every player around the board. So it's just chaos upon chaos when you have 5 or 6 players. It's just because of that chaos, the 5 or 6 player doesn't increase the width of the gateway to allow new players in. It just sets up another barrier.
Yeah.
Catan is a perfect game in terms of balance and pace and scope for 4 people. It's just say 4 players, no more, no less on the box.
But it's also the sort of thing that, if you had 6 players, you should be playing a different game.
Yes, absolutely.
But because Catan can technically be played with 6 players with this expansion, you now don't have an excuse to pivot to that other better game that you should be playing.
And to be honest, I would rather play a 2-hour game of Catan with 4 players because of negotiation or indecision or whatever than play an hour and a half game with 6 players. And experienced players can play Catan in 35 minutes.
Sure.
It just the social dynamic does not work. So We got to wind this down, Rick. What else we have?
We have that hotly debated question.
Oh, man.
So you're trying to count the number of games in your collection.
I mean, every day before I go to sleep at night, I got to tuck them in.
There you go. So do you count your expansions or do you not?
In your final game count?
In your final game count, when you brag to your friends about how good you are at playing board games.
That's kind of elitist, man.
Yeah.
We're just going to brush that under the rug. Yeah, I get weird about people bragging about how many games in their collection because everyone has, comes from a different background, has different privilege, and have a different SES. So, sure. I mean, but yes, do you count the expansions or don't you? Do you count the different editions or don't you? Do you keep old editions or do you donate them to Goodwill so they can continue to be played by underprivileged children or adults?
I mean, it depends entirely on what you're talking about, You
got to be careful with whether or not you count expansions. I mean, board game expansions, maybe that makes sense, but if you just say, I count expansions no matter what, and you have 100,000 Magic the Gathering cards, it's like, well, they're each an expansion. I have 100,000 games in my collection. No, you don't.
Right, yes.
And I understand I'm making a very simple slippery slope argument, which is problematic, but I think you need to say I have this many games and this many expansions if you want to keep a separate category personally.
Sure. But, different editions of Dungeons & Dragons are very different than different editions of Ticket to Ride.
Let's avoid going down this rabbit hole and say thank you so much for joining us for episode 28 of the Corax and Coffee Cast.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Please do like and subscribe. Check out our other content at www.coraxandcoffee.com. We have game jargon terms coming out with really fun photos a couple times a week. We're going to get back up and running with having full-fledged printed board game reviews. We have board game unboxings, and we got some other stuff coming out in the future as well, Rick.
We definitely do. And we've got an entirely new website if you haven't been there in a while. So
do check out our new website, yeah. I'm your host, Pete Steele.
And I'm your other host, Rick Hendricks.
We really hope to see you at the gaming table soon. Come to game night. You might find your spouse there. Not us. We're
not available. But
not available.
Good luck out there.
Until next time, take care, all.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Some days I feel like you can all survive without the transition music, the sheer, unbridled, high-octane charisma of our hosts, Pete Steele and Rick Hendricks, often don't need it. But there comes a time in every podcast's life when we have to add something magical to keep you all interested. Hey, it's like an expansion. That's amazing. It's almost like we planned it. I mean, I totally planned it, but that's beside the point. This episode was brought to you by the exhaustive efforts of me, Keegan King, producer, music guy, and a person who saves you from an alarming amount of ums. Thanks to all the supporters who hold us up behind the scenes. You too can keep us from going completely crazy by following us on social media, going to our website for print and play content, or even looking up at our reviews at coraxandcoffee.com. You can join our Patreon, or just rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever else you can do that. It just helps us get better. Do whatever you think is fair, even if it's nothing. That's what I do most of the time. I'm just kidding. Kinda. The quote of the week. Do you know what we call those who are afraid of that which they don't understand? Humans. Corax and Coffee. Tabletop gaming, caffeinated.